Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining me today at my weekly teachings. I'm Lori Ann. This is the first in a series of teachings by Lamb International, where I'll be sharing the weekly teachings I receive from the Lord. My hope is that you're encouraged today by this program. If so, please click the thumbs up. Also, if you'd like to stay connected to this channel for future teachings, click the subscribe button on the screen. If you scroll down to the description box on the page below, you'll find the links to all of my social media sites, as well as the link to my blog, which is entitled My Daily Letters, where I post all of the prophetic words that I receive from the Lord. Well, now that we're finished with all that, let's start with today's weekly teaching entitled The Shoreline of Self-Reliance. So to start out today's teaching, I'm going to share with you a vision that I received a few years back. The Lord asked me to share it again today. So in this vision, the Lord took me to a local beach here in San Diego where I live. And while we were standing on the shoreline, the Lord pointed out 4 different individual beachgoers. Now, the first person was sitting in a beach chair under an umbrella reading a book. They were dressed in a bathing suit like all the other beachgoers, but they had no intention of going into the water. They were quite content just to sit right where they were. Then the second person was also wearing a bathing suit, but they were walking along the water's edge about ankle deep. They lacked the desire to venture any further into the water and brave the waves. Their feet were firmly planted on the shoreline. The fourth person was actually in the water, so they were out about waist deep. And while they enjoyed splashing in the water a bit and they liked the feel of the waves and the pull of the current, they were unwilling to move past where their feet could touch the bottom. They too were hugging the shoreline. Now, the fourth person was a bit more daring, and they actually ran out towards the bigger waves right away and dove headfirst into the water. They were eager to ride the crest of the high surf. However, they too found comfort in having the shoreline visible. Just in case they grew tired or the current became too strong, they could easily get back to shore. And this is what he said to me, that each person represented a believer, and their position on the shoreline was their current depth of faith. And then he showed me that they were all struggling with the same issue. They were acclimated to the waters of faith at their current level. They'd grown accustomed to living from that depth of belief. He showed me then that this had given room for complacency to set in, and that these believers were unwilling to allow the current of Holy Spirit to carry them out beyond where the shoreline was no longer visible. Then the Lord told me that the shoreline represented self-reliance, which was really the voice of doubt. And he said, doubt was masquerading as self-reliance. Now, at the end of the vision, I saw the Lord standing off on the horizon, way beyond where the waves break. And he was motioning to his children to let go of the shoreline of self-reliance and join him out in the deeper waters of faith, challenging us to let go of everything that we use to prop up our lives, those things that make us feel safe and comfortable, but actually inhibit our growth and leave us in a state of diminished faith. So to reach the deeper waters of faith, it's going to require a change in how we think and act in our approach to life, which means letting go of self-reliance. So before we were saved, we became acclimated to dealing with life in our own strength. We were used to trusting our own judgment and how we see the circumstances in our lives. and we allowed our own limited understanding to dictate our course. But then there was that moment when we heard the truth and we began to believe. Romans 10:17 says, "So faith comes from hearing, and hearing from the words of Christ." In that moment of belief, a seed of faith sprang to life, and the Lord began coaxing it to grow. But we tend to carry that mindset of self-reliance into our walk with the Lord because we're used to trusting in our own judgment or doing what seems right in our own eyes. We tend to turn back to that. Self-reliance is actually a sinful habit that the Lord is attempting to eradicate from our lives so that He alone steers the course. So once that seed of faith was firmly planted in our heart, God then began to use our circumstances, the circumstances in our lives, as the catalyst to see that seed expand. For faith to occupy more space in our being, self-reliance has to be uprooted like weeds from every area it dwells within us. So God moves through the outside pressure of adversity to press in against those places of unbelief where doubt is still held up, causing the lies we believe to rise to the surface, giving us this then gives us another opportunity to move in faith instead of falling back into that old habit of self-reliance. This is what the Lord said to me. He said, wherever self-reliance is allowed to hold ground, faith cannot abound. Remember, the Lord is focused on our spiritual development. In 2 Corinthians 3:18, it says, we are progressively being transformed into His image from one degree of glory to even more glory. Because it's a process. God doesn't just plop us down into the deeper waters of faith, but He doesn't want us wading in the shallow waters of belief either. He wants us to learn to operate from a position of increasing faith. So He begins to teach us how to live by faith. He reminded me of Peter and his journey of faith before walking out on the water with Jesus. Now, you've heard it said that experience is the best teacher. This is what the Lord was doing with Peter and actually what He does with us. So Peter actually had already been experiencing what living a life of faith looked like, and he even how to operate in it. In Mark 6, it says that the disciples were sent out 2 by 2 and told to take nothing with them except a staff. Now, a staff represents God's authority. Remember, Moses had a staff when he went in to see Pharaoh. So Jesus sends the disciples out, it says in the scripture, in His authority to proclaim the kingdom, heal the sick, and cast out demons. Jesus was showing Peter and the disciples how to walk on the waters of faith long before Peter ever stepped out of that boat. So shortly after the story of the disciples being sent out, we come to the feeding of 5,000. So in Matthew 14, it talks about this. So at this time, it was right after John the Baptist had been beheaded by Herod, and Jesus hears what happened. So He gets into a boat to withdraw to a secluded place, but the crowds follow. And Jesus, having compassion on the crowds, begins to minister and heal. But it gets late, and the disciples want to send the crowds away to get food. Now, they had just encountered the miraculous, the manifestation of healings and deliverance. But because this challenge was much bigger in their eyes than what they'd experienced before, they immediately went back to solving their current problem in their own strength. They greeted the challenge with self-reliance because they didn't perceive it as an opportunity for moving in greater faith. Now, this was a learning moment. They had never encountered the circumstance before, so the thought of meeting it with faith didn't occur to them. But Jesus, by performing the miraculous right before them, showed them again how it is to live a life of faith, to expect the miraculous, to expect God to perform miracles. They looked out on the sea of people with their natural sight and reacted to their circumstances. We should send them away to eat. How quickly their perspective shifted back to self, or what they can manufacture in their own or on their own to meet their current need. Since their faith was limited at that point, they held no expectation of addressing the dilemma from that higher position. That's why Jesus brings the challenge: you feed them. He's pointing to the place where they could shift into a new level of faith and break free from self-reliance. The Lord does this in our lives too, by continually providing moments to discover new ways to operate in our faith. Now, these situations, when they rise, are going to hit up against our old man way of thinking and acting, especially when facing what appears to be a next to impossible situation to solve. This is what happened to Peter and the disciples. To maintain faith as a lifestyle requires a heaven to earth mentality, where we see ourselves existing beyond the limitations of this world. This means that our approach to life and the problems that we encounter looks to the resolution coming from the Lord alone instead of what we can do in our own strength. But there has to be a willingness to hold firm to faith, even when there's a strong temptation to take matters into our own hands and head back to the shoreline of self-reliance. Now, as the story describes in Matthew 14, Jesus prays over the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and miraculously everyone is fed. Remember, Peter was witnessing all of this before his faith is tested with Jesus out on the Sea of Galilee. This is what the Lord does. The Lord will test what we've learned. Now, before we pick up the story in Matthew, I want to read to you something that the Lord said to me a while back about testing. Times of testing are all part of your walk with me, a natural occurrence in the lives of my children. The process I've created so they are able to learn and to grow. It's never meant to be viewed as a punishment, but always to teach. Just as when taking an exam, you study and practice each equation before actually taking the test. But when the teacher decides you are ready, according to the lesson plan he has laid out, issues the date for you to establish what you've learned by facing the problems he has constructed, wanting you to rely on those things he has taught you. He allows that newfound faith to be challenged through testing in order to firmly plant us in that higher position of trust and belief. So let's pick up the story in Matthew 14, verse 22. So immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but the boat by this time was a long way from land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. And in the 4th watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It's a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." And Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. Now, at the beginning of this story, it says Jesus gave the disciples direction to get out of the boat and set off. But he didn't get into the boat with them. He launches them towards a destination. God will start us out on our journey, point A to point B. We know the beginning and we have the vision for the horizon he's cast, but he doesn't show us the in between. That he reveals in real time. These moments are meant to teach us how to function from the place of faith, where we wait on the Lord to propel us forward towards his promises. Faith allows the Lord to set the course and the path. Now it says in verse 24 that they were struggling to make progress. The Sea of Galilee is actually only about 8 miles wide, but because of the way its topography is laid out, storms are known to rise up just out of nowhere with waves that can actually reach about 10 feet high. So it's not unusual that they would be struggling with waves in that area or a strong current. So the wind was against them, it says. Now in the Greek, this word means against, means contrary. Metaphorically, it means opposed as an adversary, hostile, antagonistic in feeling, or act like an opponent. When we head out onto the sea of faith towards the horizon of the Lord's promises, we can expect opposition, causing our life to feel as if it's churning with waves of uncertainty forming, tempting us to turn back to the shoreline of self-reliance, where we can control the outcome. But we have to persevere, hold on to our faith, and stay the course. In verse 25, it says, by this time, it was the fourth watch, which is anywhere between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. So it's very dark. I don't know if you've been up at that time of night, but it's very, very dark, or I should say that time of morning. It's very dark then. This is when Jesus shows up. I think this is where that old saying comes from, that it's always darkest before the dawn, or just before the answer comes. Jesus shows up. Now, they're scared and they think it's a ghost at first, and the Lord reassures them. And then Peter says, "Lord, if it's you, command me to come out on the water." In other words, order me. Peter waited for the Lord's permission to step out of the boat. Though he probably thought to join Jesus out on the water, he didn't just jump out and head towards Jesus. He looked to the Lord for direction. We are followers of Christ, meaning we follow where he's leading. We don't cut our own course, trying to make God's vision over our lives come to pass on our own. It takes steps of faith done from the timing of obedience so that we remain in alignment with God's will. As I mentioned earlier, those steps of obedient faith are going to be challenged, which is what happened to Peter. Verse 29, notice as Peter steps out of the boat, Jesus didn't immediately reach for his hand. He left enough space between them so that Peter could learn to walk at this higher level of faith. But as the waves increased, Peter's faith is tested. And he listens to the voice of doubt and begins to sink. His faith was faltering at that point. Now in the Passion Translation, I like how it puts it in verse 31. Jesus immediately stretched out his hand and lifted him up and said, "What little faith you have, why would you let doubt win?" Because Peter's sights quickly fell back on himself instead of remaining on Jesus, he began to sink. In his own strength, what he was doing was impossible, because self-reliance hinders our faith. It causes our faith to falter. What happens when we experience faltering faith? Well, God doesn't abandon us, but He will usually bring that challenge around again in some form or another so that we're able to gain freedom in that place of doubt. Because the Lord wants us to learn to be fully dependent on Him to stay afloat. So years ago, we were going to a church here in the community where we live. And during that time, there was a local ministry that had been invited to come in for one of the Sunday services. And while they were there, at the very end of the service, they took an offering to bless the ministry. And Holy Spirit begins to nudge me to give the $40 that I had in my wallet. And I wrestled with that. And I was like, oh, $40. I could use that $40. And immediately doubt springs up. It's only $40. You need it more than they do. And instead of partnering with faith, I partnered with doubt because I didn't trust the Lord to be my provider at that point. And so a few weeks later, so I didn't give the money, but a few weeks later, I was out with my kids. We were taking the recycling to the recycling center, the recycling we collected. That was one of the ways that we supplemented our income was we would collect recycling and then we would cash it in to pay for groceries or gas or whatever we needed. You know, back then, $20 could more than fill up a gas tank here in California. So anyway, so we headed out to the recycling center and we get there. And as I get out of the car and I'm unloading the truck, Holy Spirit highlights a homeless man that's sitting over under a tree. And he starts nudging me to the money that I get to give to this homeless man. And so again, my faith is challenged. Was God going to provide what I needed? And so as we're counting out the bottles and the cans and, sorting, I'm going through that process of, doubt and faith and that battle. And I'm determined at this point, I'm gonna step out in faith. And so we get to the counter with the receipt for the recycling and I hand it to the cashier and he gives me the money. And my oldest son, Jacob, who was, I think, 9 at the time, I hand him the receipt and I said, Jacob, you see that man sitting over under the tree? I want you to take this money and give it to him. Now I'm watching my son take the money. I wasn't paying attention to the cashier at that point. And all of a sudden the cashier speaks up and asks me a question. And he says, are you really going to give your money to that man? And I said, yeah. And he goes, wow, I have never seen anybody do that before. And as my son comes running back, he's so excited. He says, wow, Mom, that was so cool. Can we do it again? You see, not only was my faith encouraged that day, not only did something shift in me at that point, but it impacted those around me. Listen, we have to put feet to our faith. It says in James 2:17 that faith by itself, if not accompanied by action, is dead. So here's what the Lord has shown me about self-reliance. That self-reliance prompts us to react. It wants us to take control of the situation and orchestrate the outcome. The voice of doubt is going to immediately speak up, hoping to prevent us from stepping out in faith. We are going to encounter challenges along the way. We take a step of faith and a challenge is going to come. Those are often included in the path God has designed. But if we will change our perspective on why that challenge exists and see it from the higher position of faith, then the propensity to partner with self-reliance becomes less and less until it's a thing of the past. Remember, we are to be faith walkers and not just faith talkers. Now, as I was praying over this teaching, the Lord gave me a vision, and I saw that some of you had stepped out of the boat and out into the deep waters of faith, and you were eager to head off towards the horizon that God had cast over your lives, towards where Jesus was standing. And I heard that permission had been given. But then an unexpected challenge hit and you faltered. And I heard not quite, and I sensed a feeling of missing the mark. And then I saw that doubt had convinced you that you'd missed your chance with the Lord, as if it was a one and done. And so you gave up, thinking your opportunity to see the fulfillment of God's promises had passed. So I saw that some of you in that moment had just dropped anchor and you aren't moving forward. And then I saw others of you actually ran back to the shore. But both have partnered with self-reliance and doubt. Think about this though. Jesus didn't abandon Peter out there on the Sea of Galilee when he faltered. He didn't even disqualify Peter after he denied him 3 times. Before Jesus ascended, we see him with Peter, reaffirming him, restoring him, and reaffirming his calling. You see, whatever was lost during that moment where your faith faltered, God is wanting to restore it back to you. Remember, the enemy comes to steal, kill, and destroy. Doubt robs us of faith and keeps self-reliance alive. But God is beckoning and calling you back out to the deeper waters of faith. In 2 Corinthians 5:7, it says, "For we walk by faith, not by sight, living our lives in a manner consistent with our confident belief in God's promises." Now, before we conclude this teaching, I want to read you one more thing. So when the Lord speaks to me, a lot of times he gives me things that he calls letters. So if you go to my blog site, my daily letters, that's where you'll find a lot of this. Some of them are prophetic, some are words of encouragement, some are words of insight about him, but it's all thoughts, the Lord's thoughts that he wants to share with his children. So I'm going to read this to you real quick. So this is what he said. "None of my children should be found standing upon the shoreline of self-reliance, nor should they be found dancing upon the water's edge. For those who belong to me should always seek to go further in, go beyond where the breakers roll, past the point where land is visibly seen. For it is in this space of deep abiding where they shall truly know the heart of their Father. Then let each who is willing cast off every inhibition. Let them lay aside the cares of this world. For I long to be with you in the secret place of my habitation, the deep flowing sea of intimacy where we meet face to face with no distance left between us. For here is where inner peace and rest are known. So cast your sights wholly on me and the horizon of my promises. Let everything else fade away. And when the waters begin to feel somewhat agitated and choppy, or large waves of strife begin to form, do not look back to the shoreline of self-reliance. Remember, it is my righteous right hand that shall keep you afloat. Then to all those who are willing, see, my hand is beckoning you forward, calling you out beyond where you feel comfortable, because your feet of faith can no longer touch the bottom. Know that upon these waters, yes, there will be moments where you feel as though you are sinking. But in these moments, if you understand my intentions are always good, because goodness is who I am, then these challenging seas are only about growing greater trust in me. Therefore, let go of the shoreline, set aside every distraction, clear your mind of the day and its troubles, and simply come further out deeper into the restful waters of my presence. Thank you again for joining me today. I hope you were encouraged.